Hi guys, welcome back to the Carrot Poker School. This is Grade 3 Lecture 8 and today's topic is properly protected checking ranges. Generally speaking, weaker poker players and newer poker players really don't like protecting their checking ranges because it can feel deeply counterintuitive to check with a hand that's strong enough to value bet. While I'm citing these players as the prime offenders of this leak, you see underprotected checking ranges compared to what theory would recommend all the way up through the stakes. Even some quite competent players that play fairly high are still guilty of this leak from time to time because it is just a very easy one to fall into. In today's class, we're going to learn how to keep your checking range completely protected as theory would dictate, and this will allow you to spring some nasty surprises on your opponents and ensure that you're not going to fall prey to strategies that intend to bully underprotected checking ranges or just gain too much fold equity from people not defending enough after checking. First off, one very important general idea is that of trade-off theorem. Whenever we choose to check a hand that is strong enough to value bet, we're making sacrifices on some branches of the tree for gains on others. This is important to acknowledge because it is true that when you check a really strong hand, some bad things can happen. Sometimes you run into the part of your opponent's range that would have only really invested by calling and not by betting themselves, and therefore you can reach the river in a stagnated pot and then end up showing down against a hand that you could have value bet against. When that happens, it creates a very strong impression that you've done something wrong, but when you zoom out and look at the entire tree, we can see that that's not actually the case. For example, there are some gains of checking and some sacrifices that we make by checking against different parts of our opponent's range in various situations. When we check, a gain is that we earn more from villains' very low equity hands. If you imagine that every time you make a bet, your opponent is supposed to fold the bottom X% of their range, where X equates to the pot odds norm fold equity, assuming that we're in a neutral world in terms of EV, then those hands will never give you any more money when you bet. And sometimes that's fine, because when they fold, there's a lot of denial going on as well, and you get them off of maybe a chunk of equity. But also, there are times when your opponent's hand is really dead against you, and it would be betting at some frequency had you checked, but when you bet, of course, it's the first sort of hand to hit the muck. In these cases, there is actually a really clear and distinct gain from checking. We cause our opponent at some frequency to invest further money with a hand that's in terrible shape against our hand or range. Earning more from out of position by check raising is also another key strategy. We have this rule that we've been kind of repeating all the way through the Carrot Poker School, which is that if you can check raise, you usually don't have to value bet. That rule does break down with certain blockers or in spots where villain is not doing a lot of betting after you check. For example, when you have a very polarized range against a very condensed one, it doesn't really make sense to check out of position there. You just want to go ahead and shove the rest on the river when tripling, for example. However, there are many times when your opponent's range is still polarized enough or uncapped enough that it's going to be doing a lot of betting if you check. Therefore, you can check raise as a viable way of putting money into the pot. When you do that and you run into the top of your opponent's range, you actually build a bigger pot sooner than you would by betting and getting called. Of course, if the in-position player is raising you, then that's a different story, but in many cases, if you make a big bet out of position on the turn, game theory will not play very many raises as the in-position player, and for good reason. You just don't want to be raising much when urgency is low and you're against a very polarized range. What we see here then is that when villain has the top or bottom of their range, checking is actually a better thing to do than betting in many cases, because those are the parts of your opponent's range that are going to bet at the highest frequency. Allowing villain to improve to hands that lose more money to us later is also useful, especially if our opponent has the bottom of their range. For example, somebody hitting a weaker set than your set, hitting a pair that can call down the river that they didn't previously have. These allow them to invest money, whereas when you bet, they would just be folding that bottom of range holding. There are, however, some sacrifices when checking. We do earn less on average from the middle of villain's range. Villain's medium hands are, of course, those that are likely to invest mainly by calling. They're going to check when checked to quite often because they won't have the required equity to be mandatory value bets, and in some cases they won't even be capable of value betting. And of course they'll be too good to bluff, so we will see a lot of passivity from this part of our opponent's range if we check, but that's okay. I think when people get lost here and end up thinking that they have to value bet in a spot where they actually don't, it's because they're mainly just concentrating on stacking or winning a large pot from our opponent's second best made hands. And of course, if we knew that villain had that part of their range, we would very quickly opt to bet, but we can't see our opponent's cards. We have to remember that in a spot like turn barrel, we've probably just gone ahead and made a small c bet on the flop in many cases, and villain's range is still very wide. It's going to be containing tons of strongish top pair hands that can bet the turn when checked to, and it's also going to contain a lot of hands that can bluff the turn when checked to that can actually go ahead and call a bet from us. There are sacrifices, but we have to put these into perspective and measure them up against the gains of checking, and not just imagine that villain only ever has a second best hand that we're quote unquote targeting for value. The problem with the targeting pitfall that we've already looked at in previous Carrot Poker School material is that it very firmly just imagines that villain has the middle of their range. Why would you target one part of villain's range and not another? What's the use in that? Surely it's better to zoom out and see the entire picture. Another sacrifice is losing the pot where villain's low equity hands improve. If you have something like 88% equity and your opponent only has 12%, hand versus hand, of course you don't know this at the time, and you go ahead and bet and villain folds, and then the river would have been that top pair making card that allows them to improve and make the best hand against you, costing you the entire pot. That can feel incredibly swaying as a factor. It can feel very strong, and there's a natural human instinct to try to hold on to what we've got, protect what we've already earned, and not let others have our resources for free. There's a real sense of possession sometimes that occupies the poker player, whereby when they're entitled to lots of the pot in terms of equity, they feel as if they have some sort of right to win the pot, and the only way to enforce that right and to make sure that it comes into fruition is to bet and make their opponent fold. They feel like there's something cheap or nasty about losing a pot that you were a big favourite in, but this isn't actually true. It's just another trade-off, and we should be happy to surrender the entire pot to our opponent, letting them hit a 4-out or a 6-out or something like that against us. That's fine. The rhetoric of poker that tells us that that's not okay, that there's something offensive or intolerable about that, is really the culprit here. Because if we're going to elicit more bets from our opponent's range in the long run and increase EV against those really weak hands by checking, then we should basically just see the rare times that we cost ourselves the pot as a necessary tax that we have to pay on that extra EV that we get by checking. Try to see this as you're paying for something on rare occasions whenever you cost yourself the pot by checking, and gaining back a lot of money on the more common occasions where villain actually misses and then has the chance to bluff on the next node. The easy value bet fallacy is where people automatically convince themselves that they need to value bet, or that value betting is just the only choice simply because they have a hand that's good enough to value bet. Reasoning such as I bet to build the pot, I bet for value, or we need to get value here are all just horrible reasons for betting. While value is one of the higher purposes of betting, we don't actually go ahead and commit to the idea that we need to value bet unless we've decided that the EV of betting is better than checking. The problem with these three thought processes is that they jump straight to the conclusion without actually weighing up the two actions bet and check. Take this spot for example, where big blind checks and under the gun in a single raised pot checks behind on Jack 10-9 two-tone. The turn comes to 5 of spades, and imagine that as big blind you're holding the nut flush. What's your initial instinct here? What's your first impression? What's your hand gravitating towards in terms of the button it wants to press? How natural is the inclination to simply bet for value here and try and build the pot? It's very natural, but people don't generally realize that they do this way too much. That betting and checking are actually equal EV here, and when that's the case, you want to be building a betting range that's properly protected, meaning it's protected by enough air hands to ensure that you actually get paid when you have value, and you want to be building a checking range that's protected, meaning it has enough good hands such that when you check, you're not just giving up a disproportionately large amount of the time. The natural thing to do with a good hand is bet, and the very natural thing to do with a bad hand is often check when you first start out. So lo and behold, betting ranges in the hands of a non-professional, non-really advanced poker player just end up being way too strong, and checking ranges end up being far too weak. This hand is always bet by the vast majority of amateur poker players, and the ones who do slow play probably don't remember to do it enough. If you were to look at how often a 7 of spades, just in a vacuum here, is going to be bet by a population of, let's say, 10,000 amateur poker players across different stakes between 25 NL and 100 NL on different sites, you would actually see that it's probably in the 80s or 90s that this hand is being led, not 45% of the time or whatever the solver thinks is appropriate. In order to form a solid strategy, we have to get away from this very natural instinct to bet a hand that's actually checkable. And remembering what we discussed on the previous slide, that's trade-off theorem, yes, okay, when I check a 7 of spades here and you happen to have something like King 10, I'm going to cost myself some EV because you're calling 1 and maybe 2 bets with that hand, but you're incredibly unlikely to bet it when check to, given that reopening the action with the middle of your range here isn't the best idea and the hand doesn't have a strong enough incentive for betting. In other words, checking is better for you with that hand. So if I do go ahead and check and you have that hand, and then I try to slow play the river again, going for another check raise and you check behind, and I win absolutely nothing, I may feel like an idiot. But it's that shameful feeling of winning nothing with your flush because you didn't bet that's actually the culprit thought. Your play was fine because you're making up for the times when that happens by running into the top and bottom of villain's range, which bet, and you wouldn't gain EV against them by betting yourself because they either bet anyway or they only invest by betting in the case of villain's total air. Especially here where villain is going to get to this turn with many hands that are terrible, because flop goes check check here, so they're going to have just some very bad hands here like ace 6 of diamonds or something like that, and these hands only invest as a bluff, they don't invest by calling. This is a particularly stark example. If your opponent's been calling multiple bets, it's not really the same thing because their range is much more condensed. There are exceptions to this where we're very polar and they're very condensed, and in those spots we may have to value bet hands like this, but this just isn't the case after flop goes check check here. Next up, some common places that we're going to be discussing in today's lecture where people very frequently underprotect their checking ranges. This lecture is going to focus on the common spots where even tough higher stakes players will unwittingly underprotect their checking ranges, leaving them vulnerable to aggressive exploitation, meaning we can exploit them by betting more often and with a weaker range than game theory entitles us to. Here's a non-exhaustive list of some spots where this happens. These are not the only situations where people underprotect their checking range, but they are the situations we're going to be covering today. First off, flop in position in a 3-bet pot. I just don't think that people, in general, even up to quite a high standard of poker player, protect their checking range in this situation. So something like button 3 bets, cutoff calls, and then button's supposed to check back with an overpair fairly frequently on certain low boards, but doesn't really do that. And then very naturally and easily, the in position player falls into the trap of putting far too much of a density of big overcards that aren't very strong in their checking range and not giving them enough really strong hands to value bet with later after checking back, and that means that their delayed c-bet ranges become too weak, and secondly just not enough hands to stand aggression, allowing the out of position player, the cutoff caller in this case, to just probe turn far too effectively, and river as well if they want to follow through there. Float flop in a 2-bet pot. There's a lot of checking back that goes on in game theory with hands like top pair in these kind of situations where the small blind opens pre, the big blind calls, and the small blind checks the flop. In these scenarios, big blind is supposed to wait until they value bet at some frequency, choosing, even with top pair top kicker, to delay their aggression until a future street. While that gives up some EV, the times that small blind was planning on calling down 3 times, or the times that the board runs out in such a way that they can't get value later, it makes back a lot of EV by causing small blind to lead the turn with a hand that was just always check folding on the flop. Turn barrel out of position in a 3-bet pot, this is another one. There's a lot of check jam that actually goes on in this situation. When your c-bet's been called on the flop, you're usually going to forfeit your range advantage unless the turn is some big card that smashes your range and misses that of your opponent. Perhaps a king on 993 is a bit of an exception, but for the most part, we're going to want to check a lot. In a 3-bet pot, having bet the flop and being called, there are many hands that are just not good enough for us to bluff with now because the world is not that good for our range, therefore we have to do a lot of checking. That means our opponent will do quite a lot of small betting when checked to, mainly for thin value and denial, and we'll then be able to reopen the action with a check raise and put lots of money in that way. We'll also be able to semi-bluff with a check raise. It's important that you remember to do that, otherwise the in-position player who called your flop c-bet in this 3-bet pot can just stab at the turn far too frequently for a small sizing, clean up too much equity, value bet too thinly, bluff with too much EV, and just get away with murder. The 4th spot we're going to look at is turn float bet after calling a check raise in a single raise pot. There's a natural instinct when you call a flop check raise and then villain checks the turn to bet. When you have nothing, you're going to want to take a stab at that pot because you somewhat feel like this is my chance. But actually, you'll still have the chance to bet the river quite frequently, and you'll also be able to save money by checking back against the top of your opponent's range, which was check raising you on the turn. You'll also realize more equity against that part by checking. We're not saying that checking is better, we're just saying that in theory you're allowed to wait until you take your stab at the pot with many hands there, especially in position where you're reopening the action by betting. Another thing I would add is that if you have a hand like good top pair that called the flop c-bet, you may be very tempted to take a stab in position at the pot when out of position checks on the turn, having check raised the flop. This range is giving up a lot and you will have a ton of fold equity here, but the idea is that with your top pair you can also make more money against certain parts of villain's range by checking back and calling river bluffs, or checking back and raising thin value bets on the river and that sort of thing. So you're not compelled to bet immediately, even though it feels really natural. Turn delayed c-bet in a single raise pot, actually slow playing for the second time with top pair, checking top pair back on the flop and then checking it a second time on the turn. This can feel super unnatural, but with weak kickers this is actually really standard, because the idea is that your hand isn't so strong against a properly constructed out of position range that you have to bet immediately. While the equity is high, it's not so high that betting trumps checking. And then turn probing, a spot where you really are in an unfavourable landscape quite frequently, as the out of position would be turn prober, and you have to protect your checking range again at some frequency. Check raising against a delayed c-bet is every bit as good as overbetting the pot right now for value, and you're going to want to make sure that you don't always check a weak and underprotected range that allows villain to just delayed c-bet with impunity. These are the spots we're going to focus on today. Let's start with flop in position in a 3-bet pot. Do you think that you honestly adequately protect your checking range on the following flop? Because a lot of people don't, and there's no shame in it, it's just something we want to start fixing. Under the gun checks here to cut off in a 3-bet pot, the board is 7-5-4. Notably, if this was a little bit higher, under the gun could probably build a donk range. The problem with this spot is that 4s may not open under the gun, 5s may, but they won't always call a 3-bet. 7s are definitely more under the gun's hand than cutoff's hand here, I believe, although there'll be some 7s in both ranges. But overall, this board is low enough that it doesn't create an enormous set density as a board like 9-8-6 would. So I think the higher this board is up until you hit around like 10-9-8 and then start moving into the Broadway region, which is going to favor cutoff, under the gun is going to be doing really well on the more slightly higher boards than this that are mediocre in terms of card rank. This board is still pretty good for the under the gun caller, and I think leading this board would be okay. And cutoff here is going to have to be very selective with their c-bet frequency. They're just not going to have tons of betting here. They'll bet around half of their range for a big sizing, just given they have a large nut advantage. We already know all of this by this point in the Carrot Poker School, of course, and will not be betting all the time because the equities here are somewhat neutralized by this flop. How often do you think the following hand should check here? Let's do a little exercise. I'd like you to pause the video and make an estimate. Try and write down either a number or just a descriptor. As we talked about back in lecture 2 when we were thinking about mixing checking with betting, we don't have to discuss things in terms of exact numbers. Rather, we might actually want to say something like frequent bet, infrequent bet, bets half the time, or mixes, always bets, never bets, and just use descriptors like that. It's a little bit more humanly processable. So let's reveal the answers if you're ready. Jacks is going to be betting a decent amount of the time, but not actually so much here. I'd say this hand gets bet far more than this in reality, because people start to view this hand as a very natural value bet / denial bet. There's really two things going on here for pocket jacks. Its value, obviously, because its equity comes in, is quite high and is one of the more vulnerable looking overpairs, because we can understand that our opponent may well have 2 overcards really frequently because they just have a lot of king queen, ace king offsuit sometimes, and ace queen, of course. This is a pair that you almost feel like you have to bet more than a hand like pocket kings, but what's actually going on here is that pocket kings is a much thicker value bet. Because this is an early position 3-bet pot, you're going to run into a hand like queens here pretty frequently that won't always be 4-betting. Therefore, while jacks is a bit more vulnerable to villain's folding range than something like aces is, you'll actually see pocket aces bet at a higher frequency than jacks here, because it's equally good to value bet, and that's because although the hand is a little bit more stable and doesn't fear checking as much in the sense that a queen or a king is a bad thing, queen or a king is a good thing that comes down when you have aces, because it can promote a lot of those hands that were dead into hands you can now value bet against, and you can still value bet against hands like 8s or 10s or something like fairly successfully in most cases. While the aces are more stable and like to see those turn cards roll off a bit more and aren't faced by so many turn cards, they're just a thicker value bet to start with, and of course that puts them up the list of bet frequency a bit more. Moving on to pocket 7s, this is a hand that's actually extremely high equity, and it's the only hand, believe it or not, in our list that is a pure bet here. One reason for this being a pure bet is just that it's going to unblock a lot of the merged combos in our opponent's range. Villain is going to have tons of flush draws, pair plus draw, pocket pair, overpair, that sort of thing when we hold 7s, and it's an extremely high equity hand that's just going to benefit from betting immediately. You can actually slow play some sets in 3-bet pots. The only problem here for cutoff slow playing 7s on this texture is that this board just merges our opponent's range a lot harder and creates more mediocre hands. What that does is it increases the gulf of polarization advantage, meaning that our range, and especially this hand, is now much more polarized than our opponent's range. If this texture was a bit different and villain had a more polarized range, you could happily check back with a set and your opponent will be leading a lot of air and strong hands anyway on the turn, and you'll be able to maximize EV by taking a more passive route. Pocket aces, perhaps surprisingly, is slow played less than jacks, but I think we've already gone over the reasons for that. And it really isn't a big deal. When you see a solver saying this hand should bet at a high frequency, but this one should only bet at a low frequency, that's mainly just based on the solver's intent to make its strategy as uncounter-exploitable as possible. It's basically saying if I were to check jacks more frequently, I'd be giving up a cleaner and easier route for you to exploit me than if I was to check aces at a high frequency. That doesn't really matter though, make no mistake here, it's not better to check aces than it is to check jacks or vice versa. This is just the way the solver's constructing here. I wouldn't worry about that too much. I wouldn't worry about trying to learn that jacks is only 40% bet here but aces is 80. This just seems a little bit too detailed. As long as you're mixing with both hands, it's not really a big deal. King Jack of Hearts is another surface level, fairly obvious looking bet. I mean, semi-bluffing a flush draw, what's not to like? But one of the things that misfires here in the human psyche is that we feel more comfortable inflating the pot when we have King Jack of Hearts, as opposed to when we have a hand like the King Jack of Clubs, for example. However, hands like King Jack of Clubs will still bet sometimes here with their fairly strong pair draws, and although King Jack of Clubs has an overall much lower EV than King Jack of Hearts, it has a much lower EV no matter what it does. King Jack of Hearts is a higher EV bet, but it's also a much higher EV check, and so this hand is just a mix. Both betting and checking get better as your equity goes up, not just betting, and that's why the hand is still mixing. Your brain may tell you to bet this hand and check King Jack of Clubs. That's only because it has a preference for how it feels to be in a bigger pot with King Jack of Clubs compared with being in there with King Jack of Hearts. It's not actually to do with an EV comparison. And that's why we have to be so careful that we don't end up just naturally as humans building this overly protected betting range and underly protected checking range. Pocket nines is perhaps surprisingly less of a bet than jacks and aces here in terms of frequency, but the main point here is that a hand like nines is quite medium equity, and if we were to include this in our betting range all the time, what would happen is our betting range would become more merged, less polarized, and that's the opposite of how we actually want to concoct our strategy here to be maximally unexploitable while maximizing our EV as much as possible. To think about this from villain's point of view, if you were to begin adding mediocre hands to your betting range here for inflating the pot, villain's unmade hands like the semi-bluffs, that sort of thing, flush draws, backdoors with overcards, pair plus draw, these hybrid hands, the EV of raising all of these would become much higher because we would just have more hands that are ultimately going to have to bet here and then fold, and also just have a more merged range which villain can benefit by adding aggression to their strategy and basically deviating away from GTO in the direction of just raising a lot more. So in order to suppress villain's ability to raise here, we need to maintain a certain amount of polarization in our betting strategy, and that means betting higher equity hands like aces more frequently than we're betting nines or jacks. These are visibility points though, they only cause you to suffer EV if villain is actually seeing what's going on, if your strategy is visible to your opponent in the long term and they're able to make adjustments based on that. Oftentimes in real life, we're playing in limited environments without that much volume against one opponent, or we're playing in an anonymous pool or something of this nature. And so these specific things don't matter so much, but in general, you should probably expect your opponent's ranges to be too merged here, because they're likely to bet mediocre hands like nines and jacks more frequently perhaps than hands like aces or hands like King Jack of Clubs. So that lack of polarization, that sort of condensedness, mergedness to their betting range actually causes you to want to raise more frequently than equilibrium would suggest here as the out of position player. And that would be where the exploit lies when you're facing a c-bet here. What we're saying here is by asking how we expect pool to deviate, and we can often figure that out by just considering how is it natural to deviate from equilibrium here, we can often come up with a counter strategy such as raising this flop small and more than normal that's really effective without even knowing specifically what our opponent is doing. We're just tweaking the solver's output here as the under the gun player to predict and exploit the most likely imbalances in the cutoff's range. And here I do expect these to be not enough low equity bluffing, not enough betting with hands such as aces perhaps that look more slow playable, that look more invulnerable, and too much betting with hands like jacks, nines and flush draws, which just all look like very attractive bets to the human. Let's move on to flop float opportunities now in a single raise pot. When you're the pre-flop caller and you face a check from the pre-flop raiser, they are supposed to have some fairly strong and some hands that are very capable of check raising you. What game theory is going to do, it's going to respect that, and it's going to say, okay, while I can value bet some of my strong in their own right, fairly vulnerable top pair hands, for example on this board, Queen 10, and while it is incredibly tempting to bet, it's also fine to check. If the small blind is a reasonable caliber of opponent, they're going to be check raising quite a lot here. So when the unaware beginner starts playing against the seasoned pro here and small blind checks this flop, they may be checking properly protected or even overly protected in order to take advantage of some deficiencies in their opponent's strategy. It's very plausible that when you bet here as big blind, you actually get check raised a lot by a strong opponent, and if you're betting too much of your range like Queen 10, you're minimizing the EV of those hands against the top of your opponent's range. So as people move closer to overprotecting their checking range here, the more you want to check back a hand like Queen 10, and when people are underprotecting that because you're playing in a lower stakes game, maybe you're watching this video because you've just decided to watch all of the Carrot Poker School right now, even if grade 3 is, quite challenging for you. But in the games where you play, it's something like 10NL, 25NL, 1-3 live, 1-2 live, you're coming up against people who just don't remember to check enough 10x here or don't realize that they should. And when you're against those ranges, it is okay to just go crazy here, but in game theory terms, it's not as good as it looks to just bet with a hand like Queen 10, and so there should be a lot more slow playing. The following group of hands are collectively checked 51.6% of the time by the big blind player. The in-position player is refusing to float bet more than half the time with this subgenre of hand. If we look at these from left to right here, the Queen 10, this is a hand that you will probably always want to bet against a passive and capped opponent who's unlikely to delayed c-bet bluff the turn, and who is also unlikely to be check raising you with better hands on the flop. If you're against that kind of player, your EV is going to go up considerably here for betting, and you will be against that kind of player if you frequent a game like 10NL, 25NL, 1-2 live. Of course, this grade is aimed at people playing higher than that overall, but you may just be working your way through the whole school even though you're still at a lower stake. That's totally fine. I do want to stress to the audience that are playing a bit lower here that this hand may just be a mandatory bet against many passive recreational players in your pools. But against a strong and protected checking range, this is not a mandatory bet, and if you do bet it all of the time, you're just building a range that's unnecessarily strong when you bet and weak when you check. That allows your opponent to just overfold when they face a bet and effectively start delayed c-betting until their heart's content on the turn if you check back. Ace 10, this is a hand that looks like an incredibly mandatory value bet, so Queen 10 betting about half the time, and Ace 10 is actually betting more often than this because the natural way of things is just that you want to polarize your flop c-bet and float bet strategies to some extent in situations like this where you don't have a big range advantage and can't range bet. However, you don't want to always be betting this hand. The key here is that because small blind's range does contain a ton of overpair still, this hand is fairly dead against those, and that's really going to curb its maximum equity against your opponent's range per se. Pocket 8s is a hand that you just need to check back here. This hand is not even really reopenable for a small bet. You're going to be blocking your opponent's folding range anyway. You're going to be unblocking hands that you might think is a good idea to bet against, but imagine villain has king jack of clubs. Imagine you bet and villain raises. Who do you think wins that pot more often? You're already in a fairly indifferent situation, and you've already opened yourself up to that by betting too many of the mediocre hands in your range. But if you call, you'll very often have to fold later on, or villain will just improve to one of their many backdoors or immediate overcard outs. Therefore, 8s, it's not even clear that this hand survives against a bluff in villain's range, and clearly it's doing very badly against the value region. The only thing that's actually good for 8s here when you bet is those branches of the tree where villain has one of their folds, that they have a hand with 2 overs that's actually folding, which is really rare. A lot of 2 overcard hands here like ace king are just going to raise or call. They're never going to fold. If villain does have something like, let's say, the ace 9 or the king 9 of hearts here and decides to pitch, that's okay for you, but it's not a big enough part of villain's range. So one thing that may help you understand why 8s is a pure check here in GTO is the idea that if you do run into 2 overcards, you still might not do well, because if they check call, you may lose the pot later to being outdrawn or bluffed, and if they check raise, you may lose the pot immediately or later to having to fold or being outdrawn in an even bigger pot. So it's not even inherently good to bet here if villain is holding king jack of clubs, unless you know that that's their hand, of course. The King 9 is a hand that can bluff now or later. It can check back and call a bet until its heart's content. It can check back and raise a turn bet that's small in certain configurations as well. There's just very many ways of playing a hand that's this versatile, and we shouldn't expect one to be better than the other at this point in the hand. Even if you're playing against an opponent that has too weak of a checking range here, it's not actually clear that with such a powerhouse hand with 55-60% equity against their range, that you do better by betting immediately rather than checking. You can always check, bluff later, call down, do whatever you want. This hand will even have some showdown value on some brick turns to call with and check back river, although it will bluff a lot if the board runs out wetter. The 5-4 looks like an incredibly obvious bet, doesn't it, because it's 5 high, there's an open-end straight draw, but the solver again thinks that checking back is still very possible here. I don't think I mix enough check with these hands, and I know that I need to do it. I'm consciously aware that these hands check more often than it looks like, but that subconscious pull towards betting them still, I think, makes me underprotect my check back range here. So I'm coming at you guys from a place where I'm saying, this is how you should play. It's really easy to go wrong here, and I probably actually go wrong here. This isn't hypocritical, because there's a difference, in my opinion, between showing you what theory says and understanding theory, and then actually finding the right frequency in the heat of battle. You should expect even strong opponents to not check these hands back enough, and I would like you guys to be the sort of dark horses in your pool that are able to take these plays, especially against people who are too aggressive on the turn after you check back here. There's definitely a big school of thought in low stakes poker where when big blind checks back here, a small blind goes absolutely insane on the next node, and we're going to look at a spot like this soon when we look at delayed c-betting. Our hypothesis here is that population intuitively expects check behind ranges to be more capped than they are in equilibrium. This is true at most stakes. I think it's true of the exploitatively minded players all the way up through the stakes 2-5 live, 5-10 live, 200 zoom, 500 NL regular tables, like whatever you want to imagine. I think that when you're playing against somebody who doesn't really respect your game and doesn't see you as like one of the top regs out there, they're going to expect you to be underprotected in this spot. Some very tough poker players don't do a lot of deviating, and they prefer to just play in a very sound and solid way where they're not really exhibiting any mistakes or blunders, but others are very hungry for extra EV that they gain by exploiting. And against those players, if you unwittingly check back too weak of a range here, they will punish you. They'll be looking to do it. Another way we could frame this is to say that when we're facing a strong in-position player who's hungrily trying to exploit pool, they will be stabbing turn a lot here in a delayed c-bet node as small blind, and so the best way to take advantage of that is to build a stronger range for facing that over-aggression. Bypassing thought processes now. So let's say in 3-bet pots out of position, when we c-bet flop, there's a very obvious geometrically appealing way for us to bet the turn and jam the river. So if I've c-bet the flop in a 3-bet pot, I could say something like, okay, I'm going to bet 60% pot here to set up a river shove or something like that. And then I go straight to my sizing. But you see what's happened? I've actually bypassed whether I want to check my hand in the first place. Sometimes the right course of action, and it may not be check, it may just be having a check frequency or understanding that the EV of checking the turn is equal to betting in one of these 3-bet pot, delayed c-bet, or double barrel opportunities, or any opportunity spot for that matter in the turn or river. So there's going to be more slow playing than we think. If we go straight to sizing, which I see people do, they get into a spot and they may say something like, so I'm going to bet 60% pot here to set up a river jam. Their sole thought process is actually about their sizing. They've bypassed the decision of how often they want to slow play the hand or check jam the hand, and that's why in position opponents in these spots are able to stab so effectively for thin value and denial. They're basically just not incurring the downside often enough of facing the check jam. But that implies that checking isn't an option. So when you have a thought process like this, you've actually bypassed the first necessary juncture, which is, should I turn up the way here or continue just moving right? And if you don't see the fork in the path there, then you're going to just be completely unaware that there was another option. If you only look at one option, you can only ever do one thing. This is an example of a bypassing thought process when we start making a decision, i.e. sizing, in this case, which bypasses another decision, which is whether to slow play your hand and go for the check jam instead of betting. Same thing with a draw here. You could say, okay, when I have a draw, I'm going to bet 60% pot. You could also check jam that draw. When you have a bluff that's not got much EV, you might say, okay, the right sizing here is 60% pot, but maybe you should check fold that hand some amount of the time so that you're not obviously over bluffing the turn against a strong opponent who's not over folding, and may punish you if you set up your betting range in too weak of a way with too much of a bluff to value ratio long term. So look out for these. Imagine you sat down in an Italian restaurant and the waitress asked, how would you like your steak cooked? Firstly, I would probably insist that I'd rather go to a steakhouse than an Italian, but that aside, this would be a very bizarre and assumptive question. I've not ordered a steak yet, you have many other things on your menu, why would you ask me that question? So we shouldn't do the same thing in poker. When we go straight to sizing with our value bets, we are ignoring the juncture of slow playing, and we're failing to protect our checking ranges properly. That's what today's class is all about. Small blind versus hijack, we have a B33 here on the flop, and hijack calls. This is the 3-bet pot. And in this spot, how often would you consider checking the following hands? This is a turn barrel opportunity, of course. If you would never check them, try to label your error in reasoning. What's actually happened? Why do you end up pure betting a hand that GTO doesn't pure bet? Do you have any justification for this exploitatively? Or are you simply making a bypassing error? Or maybe just misappropriating the EV of checking, underestimating how good checking is? Have a look at these hands, pause the video, and I want you to write down how often you would honestly bet these hands in game. Would you mix? Would you just bet? Would you check? Sure, it's opponent dependent, but let's assume you don't have reads and you're just against a solid looking reg at your stakes. I'll assume that you've done that and you've also written down maybe some of the reasoning why you're maybe making frequency mistakes here of betting too often. If your instinct was that kings is actually a hand that you should be checking a lot because it's blocking the calling range, this is actually wrong. Kings does a ton of betting, and the idea here is with pocket kings that while you are blocking the range that calls you, that king X hand, you're also blocking the range that bets if you check. So the blockers are kind of equally prevalent on either node. These hands have fairly neutral blockers apart from one facet about this hand, which is that by blocking trips you maybe don't want to bet big, but you can bet. So the solver is using a small bet pretty frequently with this hand because after all it's unblocking many of the hands that call a small bet, like 10x, jacks, queens, etc. Ace, queen, ace, jack. Pocket tens is a hand that's very different. This one actually unblocks the king and therefore likes using a bigger sizing. As the hand is blocking the middle of your opponent's range, it's also totally fine to slow play because by blocking 10x you're actually going to polarize your opponent a little bit more. However, because we're in a 3-bet pot, you're not going to polarize them that much because they'll have many pairs off the board here, like jacks and queens, which are actually going to be mediocre hands. Aces is a hand that you can bet small. It's just a bit of a thin hand for betting big. This isn't really to do with blockers, it's more to do with the raw equity of the holding. But you want to slow play this one a lot as well. It's tempting again with aces when you first start out to say, well, I've got aces, I've got an overpair, I want to keep betting, there's a flush draw out there, there's pair plus straight draw out there. But you guys are at grade 3 level now, or at least you've worked through the rest of the Carrot Poker Skills, so I don't need to bang on too long about that and why that's bad. But we can just suffice to say here that hands that are thin value bets are going to mix between block bets and checks. Thicker value bets will mix between bigger bets and checks, and then a hand like kings is going to be somewhat of an anomaly hand that just has certain undesirable blockers for betting bigger. You could simplify to just one sizing here. This is actually one of the kind of unfortunate textures and scenarios in No Limit Hold'em Cash where if you get rid of one of your sizes here, certain hands do lose some theoretical EV. I don't know how bad that would be in reality though, and you could easily drum up an exploitative strategy that removes the size that you think doesn't function as well for value against your opponent's range and just use one size here. Or you could meet in the middle and say I'm going to bet like half pot in this sort of spot. The straight is slow playing an absolute ton. This hand has really polarizing blockers actually because what it's doing is blocking hands like queens, jack 10, queen 10 and jacks. Maybe queen 10 doesn't get here, but you get the point. And so that's going to mean that villain just has a king much more often. When you have two hearts, you're not actually removing king X from their range because the king queen and king jack suited combos that they have, remember they don't have a lot of king queen or king jack off here in this composition pre-flop, are going to be non-diamond and non-heart. They're going to be black suits basically, or green and black suits I guess we should say in the modern day where there's 4 colors in the deck. And then this hand is going to do a ton of betting. This hand is unblocking hands that are going to check back a lot. I think a lot of the frequencies you're seeing here come down to whether we're blocking or unblocking. A hand like pocket jacks is just very abundant. So when we have a blocker to those hands, we'll typically just be polarizing our opponent's range a bit more and doing more checking. And when we unblock those hands, we'll be condensing their range a bit more and doing more betting. We saw all of this already in grade 2 lecture 5. If you check with these frequencies, you will still fold the turn, the pot odds norm amount of the time. And that means, because you've got a lot of air hands that are just check folding here, what that means is that if you check these hands less frequently than this, you will be over folding in a spot where you shouldn't be over folding by that much. So your opponent's going to be able to just get here with jacks and say, I'm just going to bet 20% pot. And if you don't have enough of these hands in your range, you're going to justify that play. And that's a bad idea because that's a deviation. I don't think villains should be able to just reopen until their heart's content in a spot like this, because they weren't doing very well to start with here in this texture, and although they've strengthened a bit by calling flop, we should still be surviving here. We shouldn't just be checking and surrendering everything. It's not one of those spots where we're like big blind against cutoff and the flop's king 3 and we have to fold 50% of our range to a small bet. It's not like that. It's a more neutral spot. It's not terrible for us, so we don't want to be folding everything when we check. Therefore, in my opinion, this spot is extremely overfolded by pool after they check here as small blind. So if you are in position and you're playing against people who aren't absolute world beaters and crushers, you should probably favor betting when in doubt, especially with your bluff region. Because if you have a hand like ace jack here and your opponent has too much air in their checking range, what will happen is that your fold equity will be higher if you bet, but if you check, you'll actually get bluffed on the river more frequently than normal, and still might not be able to call because you have a frail hand, not a bluff catcher. Therefore, you want to avoid that node where you cost yourself the pot too often and capitalize on the immediate fold equity at hand. Turn delayed c-betting now is out of position. After checking the flop and letting one street pass by without building it, it can feel deeply counterintuitive to risk the same thing happening again, especially when you're the pre-flop raiser and you know that you have a range advantage in many of these situations. However, try to realize that firstly, villain's strong value hands will always bet in position. This is because urgency is higher for the in-position player when facing a check, although that would be the opposite if they were facing a bet. Secondly, villain's air hands will all fold when we bet, and by air I mean not just any hand that's not a pair. Clearly the higher equity, backdoor draws, or showdown value hands that aren't paired will be continuing sometimes, but many of these are going to be bluffing when we check. There will also be hands at the very bottom of our opponent's range that can't possibly fathom investing if we were to bet, but can bet when checked to. Win this small blind versus cutoff 3-bet pot on a 3-flush turn, we have no reason not to try checking again with some big hands and just throwing these check raises in there. While the check raise is going to make less money from the middle of our opponent's range, as we saw when we looked at trade-off theorem, we're going to be able to make much bigger pots against the top of their range. So if villain has a bad flush here and you bet, what's going to happen is that they're normally going to call, and then you're going to bet the river and they're going to call, and maybe you jam the river or something, maybe not. But if you go for a check raise, you're just going to get all the money in very often and before the 4th spade rolls off a lot of the time. Not that that's going to happen frequently when both players have 2 spades, but it can happen. So ace 10 here, especially with the ace blocking the sort of middling part of the opponent's range, they're just more likely to have a closer to nutted hand here than average, which is not very common when they check back flop in position, but it can happen. Or they're going to have a hand that's just terrible, just utterly awful. It's going to be bluffing at some frequency here. Perhaps they just have something like the queen jack of clubs and decide to bet at some frequency. So this hand is, again, by having the ace, just making it a bit more likely that villain has a more polarized hand that's going to be betting more often, and thus it's a good slow play candidate. Jack 10, same thing. One thing I should note here is that our range in general is just doing a lot of checking on the 3-flush turn here. It's quite polarizing to our opponent, so we shouldn't worry too much about having a high global bet frequency here with range. And if we're usually checking range, we actually usually slow play a hand that's quite bad at getting value, like flush. Note here that the 10 and jack of spades are actually blocking the middle of villain's range by blocking hands like jacks with a spade and 10s with a spade that would call but not bet themselves. Therefore, it's okay to go for the check there, knowing that they won't be able to check back as often with these combos blocked. Ace-king is a hand that's just deciding to check all the time, and ace-4 is a hand that's checking a lot of the time. So basically the global frequency here for betting is low for small blind because the cutoff opponent is just very polarized here, and therefore we need to remember that on these ace-high 3-flush boards, there won't be big investments going on, there won't be many investments going on at all, and small blind has a very merged range here. By having tons of hands like kings, queens, jacks, 10s, 9s, small blind will hold the monopoly on most of those hands. Therefore, we'll just have a really merged range against a fairly polar one, in the sense that if cutoff has an ace or pair with spade or flush, they're just continuing to any sizing, and if they don't, they're probably folding a lot of the time with the queen, jack of clubs, etc. That's why there's so much checking and small betting going on here in the out of position player's range. Turn probing now. This is going to be the second last one we look at. When turn probing out of position, we can usually check the turn again. So we've checked the flop, they've checked back. We can usually just check here as a pre-flop caller and go for that sneaky check raise, building a much bigger pot than we would if we were just to start leading. That's going to be great when villain has a value bet or when they have the bottom of their range, as we've already seen from trade-off theorem. One exception to this, though, is when we have a hand that's going to heavily unblock villain's check back, but would have called a bet range, kind of a long name for a range. But yeah, that's just going to be basically medium strength hands that invest passively and not aggressively. This is a very common spot in which professionals exploit weaker opponents all the time. Weaker players tend to automatically probe the turn, so bet when flop goes check check. That means with far too many of their higher equity hands, leaving their checking ranges once again underprotected, very much today's theme. This allows the professional player to delayed c-bet in position much thinner for value and more merged, resulting in a gain of EV. You shouldn't be allowed to bet the middle of your range or any hand that's sort of close to being the middle of your range. If it becomes better to bet the middle of your range rather than check it, it means that your opponent is actually playing in a way that allows the medium hands in your range to gain EV. That can only mean that you're exploiting your opponent, so if someone is underprotecting their checking range here, do consider betting more of the middle of your range for EV gain. That's going to be like a free roll, it's like a get out of jail card for those hands that are normally restricted to a smaller percentage of the pot, and these hands can start to approach 100% pot as your opponent starts to approach 100% fold frequency. Clearly that's a bit ridiculous, and even the least protected players in the pool won't be folding all of the time, but you do get people who fold 85% of the time in that spot, and that allows your mediocre hands to be entitled to the whole pot. If they check, they can't possibly be entitled to that much, because unless villain's massively overbluffing the river with that weak range, if they check, they're meant to be entitled to only what their equity is, basically. So betting can become better than checking here when you're facing somebody who doesn't protect their turn checking range enough after flop goes check check with the middle of your range, and that's a huge swing in EV. The big blind player here in GTO is going to be checking again with some nuts and plenty of top pair and draws. When they get to the turn with a reasonable hand in a turn probe node, they're going to often just be rolling check instead of a small bet, and when they get there with a nutted hand, they're going to be rolling check and overbet or something like that in theory. And so the pile solver, as we've depicted here with this emblem, or the GTO player, is just going to have a really protected range on these nodes. The button therefore is going to be restricted, and the average delayed c-bet frequency that we see is around 40% of the time with a quite polarized range. This is because button is being handcuffed, he's being kept in line by the fact that big blind is able to check raise at a high frequency based on the fact that big blind has slow played enough of their good hands. When that stops happening, button starts to merge, starts to bet more often, and as that bet frequency for delayed c-betting approaches 100%, button is getting to a spot where they can range bet the turn. That's very bad. You should not be allowing your opponent to range bet the turn, because their mediocre hands have a lot less to gain by betting now as equities start to run further apart than they did on the flop. The amateur here is checking mostly air and weak showdown value hands, and that's just basically being a sitting duck for this merged, super aggressive turn strategy. One thing I get my students to do who play something like 50 NL in these spots is that when a weaker player checks the turn to them here and they have a strikingly mediocre but somewhat vulnerable hand, I just tell them to bet 1/3 pot, because there's really no downside. They're getting check raised 4% of the time instead of 20. They're just getting away with murder here. The pro is going to be delayed c-betting much more often with a merged range of thinner value bets and risk-free bets for denial. Denial is not usually a significant reason for betting, because it usually carries with it the downside of running into the check raise, the check call, and losing extra EV. As your opponent moves closer to not having those hands in their range, the downside of denial starts to all but erode completely, and therefore you can just bet with impunity. One caveat to this is if you're playing against someone who you know just has a terribly weak range and will bluff the river often, it may be better to check back with your medium hand and catch that bluff. Finally, turn float bet after calling a check raise. This is a really tricky node. I feel like nodes where people call check raises get really neglected in the common poker curriculum, because they're just a bit convoluted, they don't happen all the time, and you'll hear people cover check raising a lot on the flop, but you won't see them talk too much about the turn. That's why we made sure we did that in our previous class, Raising and Beyond. When you've called a flop raise in position, try to understand that villain's range is now a bit more polarized than it was before. Therefore, we should refrain from betting for thin value when check 2 on the turn. This is especially true when the turn is a brick and villain's range remains quite polar. And it's even more true against pool, because they don't tend to raise enough one pair on the flop. They don't tend to merge their raising range on the flop unless they're a weaker player, aka a fish. That's the less correct older school term. But yeah, those players are going to sometimes just merge for the hell of it. They're going to raise flop to find out where they're at or something. They're going to be a bit more merged and a bit more erratic and all over the place. But I think that regs that play lower stakes games and mid stakes games are very often just too polarized when they raise the flop, and they just have a draw too often. They have the nuts too often. They don't have enough mediocre thin value raises. We looked at this when we mapped out the 5 portions of value raising on the flop, and a couple of them are merged hands like thin value raises and hybrid hands. In this spot, button is going to B33, not range bet, because this isn't really a range bet board, but bet some of their range on the flop, and big blind is going to raise to some sizing, probably 3x, 4x, 5x, somewhere around here. Button's going to call, and then the turn is going to go check from the raiser. When somebody polarizes and then checks, they will recondense slightly, but they're still going to have mostly a polarized range because on the flop they just don't have a lot of mediocre hands. So you can't expect big blind to suddenly show up with lots of hands like pocket sevens because they didn't raise that hand on the flop in GTO in the first place. Button's job here is not to do a ton of betting and probably to bet small when they do bet, because big blind in practice probably doesn't have enough queen X in the reg portion of your pool. Again, weaker players are a little bit different here. I'm way more inclined against a weaker player to just start blasting with king queen twice here, because I feel like I'm going to run into queen 9 all day, every day. But against a solid reg that's a bit more polar here, their range could be polarized enough that there's not a lot of point in betting. And game theory certainly thinks that with certain hands here, there's less betting than there should be, and button is therefore incentivized to mix a lot of checks. In other words, a hand like queen 10 doesn't gain EV by betting small. While it can bet small, it doesn't gain EV. And because button just has so many other mediocre merged hands here, like pocket pairs, pair of 8s, pair of 4s, etc., ace king, and they're going to want to check those back, even a hand like queen 10 can just wait until it value bets. It's not a hand that has such a high investment ceiling that it perhaps needs to go away and start blasting immediately. It can just wait until the river and then make a value bet there, and it'll obviously gain from the bottom of big blind's range by checking back turn and allowing a reignited river bluff. If big blind doesn't actually slow play the turn enough, they may be over bluffing the river, and then the check back and call line is even better. Queen 6, this is a hand that's just below the point where we can begin value betting. Again, the solver here thinks that the big blind's range is still polarized enough that it doesn't make sense to bet this hand. If you're playing against someone that's like super capped here, I guess it could make sense for a very greedy thin value protection bet, but you'd really need to have a read to make such a play. King Queen is a hand that's a lot better, but it's still only optional. If you surveyed 1,000 players that played 100 NL or 100 Zoom here, I would think that they would be betting this hand maybe like 80 or 90% of the time rather than 60. That would be my guess. And ace 8, this is actually a strange hand that's acting as a hybrid. When you bet this hand, I think you're getting a little bit of fold equity from better from time to time, though not much. You're getting a lot of useful fold equity because your pair is low, and it starts to function as a value bet because you have so much going on here. If you get called by a better hand, you have like a million outs, but you also just get called by worse sometimes. Because the turn is a street where hands call in a non-linear fashion, where you'll get called by a 4 but not by pocket 9s, or you'll get called by a flush draw but not by a certain other hand that beats you, then you're going to be able to bet these weird hybrid hands for a mixed bag of different reasons. Basically, the betting sink, as we outlined in grade 2, is full here when it comes to ace 8 of hearts because there's just such a myriad of different benefits to betting. Homework task 8 is for the following two spots. How do you expect small blind's checking range to differ from the solvers in whatever games that you play? And this will absolutely vary from stake to stake and game to game, so I'll leave this up to you to decide. I'm not going to come in here and start disagreeing because different stakes, different populations, different players, there's going to be different reads. But maybe just picture like the average reg from your game. Picture a certain player you know in real life that you play against a lot in the casino if you're a live player. Something like that, and try to compare their checking strategy or what you expect it to be in real life to that of the solver. Then look at Button's response and assess how and why you would adapt it. This is the core to using a solver intelligently. This is the real key here. What we want to do is look at what's different, go to the next node, and then ask how we would adapt that response. Remember that Button's strategy here is very much built by understanding what small blind is doing in equilibrium. So when that changes, if the solver knew about those changes, it would also change its strategy. So that's what I want you guys to do. Have fun with this task, and I'll see you back here for lecture 9 when we're going to examine a few 3-bet pots. See you then.